So to make the sauerkraut, you're going to need enough cabbage to fill your container once it's all shredded and compacted. So it's probably going to look like more than in your container, and we'll just see how this fits. You're going to need a knife, a shredder, or you could also use a food processor that automatically grates the cabbage for you, but a grater is perfect. You'll need a bowl, a mason jar, hopefully one that has an adjustable kind of lid that you can make it so it's not completely tight. You're going to need your salt, and I use a rock to pound the cabbage with, but any hard object will do, and just a spoon to measure the salt with, and of course a cutting board. So in order to make the sauerkraut, you are going to want to set aside one of the bigger pieces of the cabbage for later. So with the rest of the cabbage, you just remove the bottom. I usually try to cut it as a circle to get as much of the hard part out as possible without sacrificing too much of the leaves. And be careful to always cut away from yourself as much as possible. So then, once you've got your cabbage, you're going to use the bigger holes on the grater, because otherwise it will take forever and make it too slushy. So you're going to want to use the bigger holes, and you just grate it. It's a little bit difficult because the cabbage might want to fall apart, but basically just grate it. So don't worry too much if there's pieces that are separating and falling off of your cabbage. You can just chop them up with the knife afterwards. So once your cabbage is at the point where there's no point in trying to grate the pieces anymore, you can just take the part that's inside the grater, put it into the bowl. With these bigger pieces, you can just take your knife and chop them finely. So the smaller the pieces are, when you put them in there, the better, as long as they're still pieces and not mushy. You don't want to turn them into mush, but you do want them to be small because it increases the surface area that the bacteria that are going to break down this sauerkraut are going to have an easier time digesting it if the pieces are small. So it's like when you chew your food, you want to make sure your food is chewed for digestion. It's similar for sauerkraut. You're going to make all these surfaces and edges available for the bacteria to properly break down. It's good to have a bigger knife too, because it makes things go a lot faster than if you tried to use like a paring knife or anything. That would probably take a very long time. So that one small cabbage looks like this in the bowl. So there's a chance that I'm going to be ending up filling up 2 of these containers. In order to start the process of extracting the juice out of the cabbage, I'm going to add a little bit of salt now. So in total, probably going to want about 1.5 tablespoons, although I usually don't really measure. I'll put in about half a tablespoon now. So the reason is that the salt is going to start pulling the liquid out of the cabbage. So that can get started. So in case I need to make a second batch, I'm going to take out a second whole leaf and put it aside. So same thing again, once it's not comfortable for you to grate anymore, because you never want to get your hands too close to the grater or else you could grate yourself. Keep those extra pieces aside. Put the grated parts in your bowl. And then just cut by hand whatever is left. And same thing with the knife. I know that by this camera angle, it looks like my fingers are really close to the knife, but they're actually about an inch away. And keep your fingers tucked. So instead of having your fingers flat where you could accidentally cut yourself, make sure that you turn your fingers inwards. So at this point you don't need the knife, the cutting board, or the grater anymore, so I took those away. So now the cabbage looks like this, and this is already broken down quite a bit, but as you can see it still looks pretty dry. So when you're making your sauerkraut, you want to make sure that there's a lot of liquid because there's kinds of bacteria that grow in air and there's kind of bacteria that grow in water without air. And you want to grow the kind that grow without air in your sauerkraut. So the best way that you can make sure that those proper kinds grow is by making sure that the whole thing is submerged in liquid and packed down. So salt is going to help because salt is going to help draw the water out of the cells of the cabbage because water is drawn to try to balance out the inside and the outside of the cell's wall. So if you add salt before you start pounding your cabbage, it's going to help release more liquid faster. So I already added about half a tablespoon. I'm going to add another heaping tablespoon of salt. Like that. You want to have a good amount of salt in there just because the salt helps create the right environment too for good bacteria to grow in. So my hands are clean. First I'm just going to mix in the salt, toss it around. And then you can take, I like to use a rock. I've cleaned this rock because it's very easy to hold on to. However, you can use anything around your kitchen. You can use a spoon or a potato masher or anything that you think is going to help you break down this cabbage into a state where liquid is being released. So basically you just... So you don't have to do this for too long. Just make sure that you've gotten all the pieces and that it's starting to release some liquid. It's also going to help pack it together so that there's no air in between the cabbages when you put it in your container. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. You can see that it's looking more moist and more compacted than before. So you can just rinse off whatever you used to pack it down. I find that if you rinse everything as you go along, you don't have to spend much time cleaning up. So there's the cabbage. This is the container. Make sure that your container is very clean. Some people boil them. I just make sure to wash them really well and then dry them so that there's no chance that this is going to have any bacteria from whatever was in it before. That's basically the idea. So now I'm just going to put the cabbage into the container. So as you go, you can make sure that it gets packed down. Same thing, you don't want it to have any major air pockets in there while it's growing. Oh yeah, and this is where I forgot to mention, you're going to need a bit of liquid from either making kefir, you could use the whey, or you could use the liquid from a previous batch of sauerkraut. So I have this liquid that's left from sauerkraut. This is raw unpasteurized sauerkraut. It's from Quebec, so it's not super local, but that's what I have. So I'm just gonna pour that into here. If you do it at different intervals, it'll help fill in the gaps as you're going along. So that, since it's raw and unpasteurized liquid, it'll still have all the bacteria to get this fermentation process going. And once you've made your own sauerkraut, you can use that liquid, just save some of the liquid, for for your next batch, and you can just keep doing that, and you never have to buy it except for the first time. So you can see that as I'm squishing this down that some liquid is rising up. That's exactly what you want to happen. And you're going to want to make this container pretty full just to minimize the amount of air that's in there. But at the same time, you don't want to fill it all the way up to the top, because as this cabbage ferments, it's going to change in size. So if you fill it really close to the lid, there's going to be liquid that comes over the top and it's going to start leaking. So you're going to want it to be full enough that there's not too much air, but not so full that it starts to leak. This is probably about a good level to pack it to, although it doesn't have to be exactly like this. And I'm just going to add a little bit more liquid so that it's nice and submerged. You want all of those pieces to be under the water. And then people have different methods of doing this, but you're going to want something to keep that liquid down. To keep the cabbage underneath the surface. So what I like to do is just take a leaf, and this one's a bit big, so I'm going to tear it in half. And you can cut this up and add it, because I still have a little bit left, so I'll probably put that in a small container after. And then you're just going to want to stick it in there so that it keeps all the cabbage packed under the water and holds it down. The idea is that it's going to hold the sauerkraut down. And mine has a little bit of cabbage that's floated up in very tiny pieces, and that's fine. That's not a big deal. It's just so that the surface of the sauerkraut is under liquid. That way you won't get any unwanted kinds of bacteria growing on the surface of the sauerkraut. That's what your container is going to look like. There's different colors of cabbage, so it might be red, it might be more green, but that's the central idea. So then you're going to take your lid, and you can see that these kinds of lids, I use this from another product, you can see that these are going to come apart. So just put it on there, and just have this really quite loose. You definitely don't want to tighten it, because this is going to change in pressure. So even having it quite loose is good, because you only want the lid to prevent things from getting in to the container, but you do want air and potentially liquid, if it's gonna overflow, to be able to escape the container. If it ferments with a very, very tight lid, the container could actually break from the pressure that's being created. So you definitely want to make sure that you leave just quite a loose lid. At the same time, no flies or whatever are gonna get into here. If you don't have a lid like this, you can always just buy some cheesecloth, put it over the top with an elastic, or even, a dishcloth kind of thing, and just put it over the top with an elastic. That should be fine. Just make sure that it's not absorbing liquid, so just keep checking on it and make sure if the liquid starts to overflow, it's not good to have that damp sitting on there, so just make sure that you change it if that happens. And with this, you might want to put something underneath it, like a piece of paper towel or something when you put it in the cupboard, if you feel like you need to protect the surface that it's sitting on, just in case it does overflow. So that's what it's going to look like. And I'm going to put this in a dark cupboard where it won't be disturbed, and I'm going to put it there for at least 2 weeks, just to make sure that it's fermenting nicely. And you can do various difference of time depending on how you want your sauerkraut to taste. You'll notice that it starts to bubble, it starts to change. That's exactly what you want. And then after that, you can keep it in the fridge, and it can be in there for up to 6 months. So if you have any questions, you can write them in the comments, and I'll make sure to answer them. And there you go, that's how you make sauerkraut.